Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Y Media Newsroom. It's always so great to spend this time with you. So, the latest reports are that the Pentagon has reportedly raised its counterintelligence assessment of Israel to critical. This heightened threat category is coming at a very critical time. This essentially means that the concerns are that Israeli intelligence agencies have intensified their efforts to monitor U.S. officials' involvement in negotiations during this time where we're seeing this peace deal take place, negotiations between Iran and the United States. So now this is reflecting, tensions between Washington, D.C. and Jerusalem, despite this long-standing alliance between the two countries. The greatest allies, they say, is the United States and Israel to each other, and they are in an ongoing conflict with Iran that's taking place right now. And so this is very concerning, and we've heard reports from previous week, as you know, that President Trump and Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, have essentially had disagreements over the phone during this time with negotiations with Iran for a peace deal, to which the Prime Minister of Israel has said that, overall there are some disagreements, but that the President of the United States and himself agree on most things. And you had President Trump go on the record saying that, he said, the Prime Minister of Israel's sometimes crazy about some of the things he does. And we've heard the president say the F word last year during that 12-day war, saying that, it's just things are out of control. And so you have this taking place at a time where you have this dispute between, we've heard rumors between President Trump and, trying to push on diplomatic settlement with Iran, while you have Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that they favor more aggressive military approach on Iran. So very different perspectives on how to approach Iran. And to this, we know the president of the United States is trying to have a peace agreement, saying that that would be binding, that Israel would have to follow it. And then you had the latest developments, the escalations between Iran and Israel that took place over the weekend. So now US officials have reportedly believed that Israeli intelligence is seeking inside information about American negotiating positions and discussions with Tehran. So, according to multiple reports, concerns have escalated after US personnel operating in Israel allegedly discovered software capable of monitoring communications on government devices. Israeli officials have strongly denied any espionage against American personnel. So this is, the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency reported this. They reported it's elevated Israeli counterintelligence threat is rating at a critical level, and the memo was sent internally. Now, U.S. officials are concerned that Israel is attempting to gather intelligence on American deliberations regarding Iran when it comes to this peace proposal. And reports indicate that the senior U.S. officials involved in Iran negotiations may have been targeted and may be targets of intelligence collection efforts. Israeli officials deny any spying on American government personnel, and this concern is emerged during this disagreement we've heard between the two leaders, between the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States, when it comes to ceasefire talks on Iran, whether to pursue diplomacy or to pursue, aggressive means in terms of an escalation in a war. This critical status is alarming, because, critical means red alert, that this is something to pay attention to, even though Israel is saying that they deny, this claim. So this is a time where the president also has to consider, what does this mean? Because we know the president has had massive backlash from MAGA influencers and supporters when it comes to this war with Iran. From the likes of Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and the rest of the MAGA influencer movement that essentially supported Trump to get back into office for a second term, and how now are, speaking against the war in Iran and against the president's actions. A lot of people claim that the president was coerced into a war with Iran, to which he denies any of those claims, saying that he took all the measures himself. So this now you have this heightened critical status from Pentagon, which is very alarming because this story is very significant because it involves two of the closest intelligence partners in the world. The United States and Israel routinely share intelligence on terrorism, on Iran, cyber threat, and regional security. So when Washington publicly elevates, this is a public, like the fact that we're talking about it is that Washington made this public that they have concerns about Israeli espionage, right? This is not just an internal memo at a critical level. They've made this public for the rest of us to know. It signals a very rare level of distrust between these two countries that are the greatest allies to each other. The timing is important because the disagreements coming as the White House is attempting to prevent, a wider Middle East conflict that we've seen take place most of this year. So this is at the same time as continuing its negotiations with Iran, the back channels through Pakistan, and the negotiations it's taking on with what's happening in UAE and Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait. All of this is all part of them wanting the United States to come to a peace deal. We know those GCC countries have asked the president to go more diplomatic route because it's affected their GDP. Like Saudi Arabia was one of the biggest investors in the US economy, and it's pulled its money back on a lot of its investments, and that affects the president. Also, the president, the inflation numbers went to 3.8% last month because 40% of that was energy costs that have gone through the roof because of this conflict. So every way you slice and dice this, the president needs to make a deal and end this war and move on to his other commitments for what he wants to accomplish the rest of the time he's in office. He's already been in office for a year and a half. We're looking at another 2.5 years of him being in office, of which a year plus goes into general election debates, the new next Republican candidate for president, and that, so his essentially his influence starts weaning down because he's on his last term, and within a year or so, he's not going to have the same influence because the Republican Party and everyone else is looking at who's the next candidate and who's going to be driving the headlines and what are their positioning, whether that's Secretary of State Marco Rubio, whether that is Vice President JD Vance, whoever, or maybe it's a third option that we're not aware of yet that's going to come too. So he's got a very small window, and the midterms are around the corner in the fall. And we've already seen that even though, the candidates that the president has backed, a lot of them have gotten in through the primaries, except one of the key battlegrounds, an Iowa governor race, and his pick of candidate didn't get in. So this is very critical timing for the president as he's looking to make sure he goes through a diplomatic route. So now intelligence gathering between the two allies, United States and Israel, is something that they do. So when you have your closest partner, where you seek information from, you need to essentially know that they're not doing any espionage on you, trying to gather intelligence on your own public officials who are part of this very sensitive negotiations with Iran. And so this is a larger story that may not be just about espionage itself, but it's showing that there's possibly a growing policy difference when it comes to Washington and Jerusalem when it comes to Iran. So when allies begin worrying about each other and worrying about whether they can trust each other behind closed doors and if they're being spied on, it's showing a much deeper disagreement and what could be in terms of regional priorities between the two allies on how they move forward, and in this case they would move forward with Iran and the escalations that are taking place in Lebanon. Now, another interesting headline that, everyone watched and it had millions of views is President Trump's interview over the weekend, essentially with NBC. He abruptly ended the interview. It was on NBC's Meet the Press after a heated exchange with the moderator, Kristen Welker, over repeated claims that the United States election was rigged, if you recall, when he lost to Joe Biden, and the questions about compensation for January 6th defendants. If you know that there is a $1.8 billion settlement fund, and this is there that the president tried to push forward to say that, hey, this is a fund that in case the government goes against people, then they could have access to this fund to be able to pay for their legal debt and legal fees. And to this, it would potentially apply to the January 6th defendants. And to that, there's a lot of pushback by Republicans. It seems like it still may go through, but these are questions that were confronted, and it quickly became one of the most talked about political media moments of the weekend because here you have this interview that's recorded in Wisconsin. It was aired on Sunday and covered a range of topics, including the Iran-Israel conflict, election integrity, and the California governor's race, and Trump's proposed 1.8, billion dollar anti-weaponization fund, which would essentially benefit January 6th defendants. And so tensions escalated after you had the reporter repeatedly ask President Trump to provide evidence supporting his claims of the 2020 election, saying that it was rigged and what's going on. And to that also, the president said that the mayoral race in California and Los Angeles is also rigged. We're going to cover that later in today's show. But you had Trump accuse NBC and the interviewer of being crooked, arguing that the elections were being manipulated, and became increasingly frustrated as he was being challenged of his assertions. So now I'm going to let you watch it for yourself. Take a look.
You're crooked, and Meet the Press is crooked, and so is ABC and CBS and CNN.
But Mr. President,
you're one-sided crooked networks. All right, let's call it quits because I've had enough. Thank you, darling. Have a good time.
Mr. President, let's please. I traveled all the way to Wisconsin.
I've sat in the rain with you.
I know.
I've sat in the rain with you for an hour, on and off in the rain, and I've given you enough time. You ought to straighten out your press because you know what?
Mr. President,
a country can never be great with a dishonest
Listen,
press.
we traveled all the way to Wisconsin for this interview.
We have more evidence. There's
There you have it. That was an interview that aired on NBC's long-running political program, Meet the Press. It's been on TV since 1947. The president walks out, and you can see that the interviewer is begging him to stay because she said, they've come all this way to have this interview with him. And yeah, this made rounds. And so this incident reflects, this continuing breakdown in terms of the relationship between President Trump and much of mainstream media. We've seen this throughout his first presidency, his second presidency, second term. And supporters argue that journalists are unfairly hostile towards him, right? Which is where the term came, fake media, fake news. And so this is, you're watching this take place about, challenging some of Trump's positions on a rigged election and some of those notions. And to this, if you recall, his administration hasn't been able to provide any sort of evidence that the election he lost to Joe Biden was rigged. This is a time where you had Tulsi Gabbard, essentially, his pick, come in to be able to refute this and to be able to find evidence. If you recall, Kash Patel, director of FBI, was also supposed to find the evidence on how if that election was rigged based on his claims, and yet they haven't provided any of that evidence. So when you have the press asking questions about a rigged election and to show, where's the evidence? Can you share that? You had the president, and the interview and say all those things. So now what does that mean? Essentially, you could see it in two things. President Trump's MAGA supporters would likely see this walkout as evidence that he's refusing to submit to what, they view as hostile media questioning, right? Fake news, that the headlines are all to make him and his administration look bad. And then you have on the opposite side, the critics of President Trump, right? You don't really have people in between. They either love him or they hate him. And so you have his critics viewing this as another example of him avoiding difficult questions, that he just makes claims and he's not able to back it up with facts. And just walking out as a way to end, being in a position of having to really show about why he's saying what he is and what are the reasons behind it. So this confrontation, plays in his favor when it comes to MAGA in many ways because it says he's pushing back and he's not afraid to push back on mainstream media. But then on the other side, it's showing that he is again avoiding, responsibility for what he says and what he puts out in mainstream media. And coming here to Canada, big news for Canada has now officially welcomed a new Governor General today. Louise Arbour was sworn in as Canada's 31st Governor General, succeeding Mary Simon. Arbour's appointment marks a significant moment in Canadian public life, bringing one of the country's most accomplished jurists and international human rights advocates to Rideau Hall. Now, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, announced on May 5th that King Charles III had approved Arbour's appointment. She becomes Canada's first Governor General appointed during the reign of King Charles III and the first appointed on the recommendation of Prime Minister Mark Carney. Arbour is widely regarded as one of Canada's most respected legal minds. Her career includes serving as Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Chief Prosecutor for the International Tribunal of Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Louise Arbour was installed as Canada's 31st Governor General today. Big news for Canadians. And she served as Justice of Supreme Court of Canada from 1999 to 2004. As a UN prosecutor, she oversaw landmark war crimes prosecutions and helped secure the first genocide conviction under modern international law. She later served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and led reviews into misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces. And her first official act as Governor General was scheduled to be a visit to the National War Memorial as Commander-in-Chief of Canada. This is very significant because for more than 50 years of public service, spanning from Canadian courts to international tribunals, human rights advocacy, and public inquiries, she's now the next Governor General. She's the recipient of nearly 100 honors and awards, including approximately 42 honorary doctorates. She has served for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights between 2004 and 2008. And it's big news that now she's the 31st Governor General since Confederation and is the first appointed by King Charles III. So big news on this, as Louise Arbour is arguably one of the most qualified individuals ever appointed to Rideau Hall. Unlike some of the Governor Generals who came before her, some on journalism and diplomacy and academia, you have, Louise Arbour. She arrives to Rideau Hall with an extensive experience in constitutional law, international justice, and public accountability. So we look forward to see what her appointment will mean when it comes to the role that she plays in Parliament and in representing the King in Canada. This is, a very significant day in Canada today. And Canada's national security watchdog is also warning that budget cuts are coming at exactly the wrong time. So you have the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. They oversee intelligence and national security activities across the federal government. They say it faces significant funding reductions even as Canada's intelligence environment becomes more complex. And that is because of cyber threats, foreign interference, terrorism concerns, AI, and growing geopolitical tensions. So you have the NSIRA that was created in 2019. Essentially, they're an independent oversight of Canadian intelligence and national security agency, including activities in CSIS, the Communications Security Establishment, SCE, RCMP, National Security Operations, and other federal departments. And their mandate is to ensure intelligence and activities comply with Canadian law and respect civil liberties. So you're having this take place at a time where they're doing their assessment and they're saying that, that the cuts are not so great at this time where Canada is trying to grow its defense spending, it's essentially its defense portfolio. You have the Arctic security issues. You have, the increased spending by Canada for 2% GDP as a NATO member, going over to 4%. So this is a very critical time, and the agency is now finding that itself caught in the situation where you have Ottawa's government's wide spending review, which is reducing expenditures when it comes to multiple departments and agencies. So we have Ottawa that's trying to cut back on its agencies and its overhead, but at the same time, it's increasing its spending when it comes to defense at a critical time for national defense. So you have Canada's security agencies are confronting increased sophisticated challenges, including foreign interference, cyber attacks, and AI-enabled threats, espionage, and border security measures. So this is very critical for that. So you have some of the background here is that the NSIRA is facing a mandated reduction of approximately 15% over 3 years, and this is what has highlighted their concern. The agency officials warn that the cuts will likely result in fewer reviews and reduced oversight capacity. You have Senator Andrew Cardozo, a member of the Senate National Security Committee, saying that the reductions make him a little nervous because the oversight is essential for public trust. And you have NSIRA saying that they reportedly sought additional funding from the federal government, but has not yet received a response. The agency is, trying to prepare for its expanded responsibilities, but they're saying that, when it comes to Canada Border Services Agency, they're saying the cuts are just going to hinder their ability to do so. So they plan on spending reduction of 1.3 million of 2026 to 2027, 1.8 million from 2027 to 2028, and 2.7 million reduction in 2028 to 2029. The agency is expected to eliminate approximately 12 full-time positions by the year of 2028 to 2029. And they're saying that their planned budget for 2026 and 2027 is approximately $18.4 million, and that's supporting 85 employees. But the watchdog has reviewed Canada's national security activities since 2019, and they're saying this is a very high concern. So you have dollar savings appearing relatively modest compared with potential risk. You have the same thing where, you need to be able to measure your risk in a heightened security environment, but when you have cuts to personnel and operations, that's going to make it very hard. So the government is, in this position, and that's why the escalations have been made on when it comes to, making sure that Canada is in a position for high security when it comes to the era of AI, cyber warfare, foreign interference, and growing intelligence operations that many Canadians may conclude as this is an accountability that's more important and not less. And so that is part of the what's happening in Ottawa. And when it comes to defense industry, it's also urging the federal government to provide a clear roadmap for military spending because Ottawa is accelerating its effort to meet exceeded NATO spending commitments. But then you have defense contractors saying that they support the government's spending ambitions, but need greater certainty around what it means when it comes to procurement priorities, what are the timelines, and how smaller Canadian firms can participate in what could become the largest defense buildup in generations. Like we're talking about in, 3.5 years, we're going to go from 2% GDP Canadian GDP spending on defense to 4%, so doubling that. So that's very significant. Canada has faced criticism from NATO allies for failing to meet its alliance targets of 2% GDP. It was sitting at 1.4% GDP until just recently, or until just months ago, right? So you have the Carney government that has since launched an aggressive military investment strategy focused on rebuilding the Canadian Armed Forces, modernizing equipment, and expanding domestic defense manufacturing. So you take that into consideration since Canada has reached its NATO 2% benchmark of this year, but it's going to double that and it's going to double its spending. So industry leaders are saying, hey, the challenge is no longer whether the money will be spent. Now the challenge is how quickly and efficiently it can be translated into contracts, production capacity and military capabilities. We know the Prime Minister has said essentially that he wants to make sure that some of these contracts, are being supported by Canadian-made industries and Canadian manufacturing. And we know that it's agreeing on to some of the contracts with European Union allies to be able to have more defense spending with them and potentially remove some of this defense spending that it goes to the United States in terms of procurement. So the defense contractors are now saying, okay, the money's there, you're spending it, but we need a clear plan from Ottawa outlining what are your priorities, what are the timelines for us to be able to meet it. The smaller defense firms that want to take, Canada First approach and say, yes, we want to be able to bid for these contracts and service them, they essentially need better guidelines on how to access upcoming procurement opportunities. And that is part of, spending in Canada, creating Canadian jobs, Canadian products, but they need to know, well, how do we bid, right? What are the procedures? What are the opportunities? What are the timelines? Canada is also pursuing major investments in submarines, aircrafts, drones, sensors, radar systems, and military infrastructure. So you have the government has created this new defense investment agency to streamline procurement and reduce bureaucratic delays is what they say, but overall Ottawa has yet to come up with these timelines in terms of where that money's going. So Ottawa has also they said they've unveiled their defense industrial strategy aimed at expanding Canada's domestic defense manufacturing sector to be able to create that as an industry, for Canadian jobs, Canadian domestic defense products and manufacturing, but this is at a time where they're wondering how. And, to have clear communication, this is something that the minister needs to be able to do and create some of those clear outlines. Canada has spent more than $63 billion, $63 billion across defense-related initiatives over the previous year. And that's a part of its accelerated military modernization program. CANSEC, that was in Ottawa just a couple of weeks ago, had 20,000 people show up. And that is, a massive military convention. So Canada's approximately 600 defense companies directly supporting 36,000 jobs and more than 61,000 jobs across broader defense supply chains. So Canada's defense sector has generated approximately $14.3 billion in annual revenues, and that contributes to $7.4 billion in GDP. NATO members have also agreed in 2025 to work towards spending 5% of GDP on defense and security related investments by 2035. So that's another, including a 3.5% for core defense spending. This is all happening way too fast as countries are increasingly increasing their defense spending. Defense spending debate has shifted dramatically. It went from years of questioning whether Canada would meet NATO commitments and whether it should prioritize NATO commitments. And today, now the question is how Canada spends the money and what are the timelines to get that money out the door and how to be able to bid for that money, for those contracts. So this clear long-term procurement strategy could create thousands of high-paying jobs, strengthen supply chains, improve national security, but the question remains if spending is rushed without a coherent industrial plan, Canada will risk buying extensive equipment, right? You don't want to be able to double your efforts and buy equipment you don't need or multiply that and miss the opportunity to build long-lasting domestic capabilities, right? If the money goes out fast to existing defense firms, then where's that strategy of helping Canadian defense firms start up? Right? Or to be able to grow. So there's a lot of that taking place as the defense industry appears to, they're willing to invest, but it's about, predictable signals from government. And when it comes to committing capital and expanding domestic operations and expanding its operations to other allies as well. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.